Hi, Charles of SirBookSage here, and this is my book review for Samuel R. Delany's The Motion of Light and Water, Sex and Science Fiction Writing in the East Village. This is a book I've been reading for Nonfiction November, and it is a autobiographical memoir written by Delany, particularly about his time as a younger writer living in the East Village in New York City in 1961. Now, a little backstory to Samuel R. Delany. He's one of my favorite science fiction authors of all time. He's an absolutely brilliant writer. I love how his brain thinks when it comes to language, particularly the English language, and story. And if you have not read any of his books, I highly recommend them. If you're a regular watcher of my BookTube channel at all, you've probably heard me mention Delany's name many times. This, however, is not one of his fiction books. This is his memoir. And Samuel R. Delany is a young black man married in an open marriage to a young white woman, and they moved to the East Village back when the East Village was a ruddy, rundown little place. It was kind of a burgeoning bohemian center filled with poets and writers and everyone kind of in the literary industry in many ways in New York City. And they moved down there. And it's about his early time building his craft as a writer, and it covers, I think, the publication of his first 4 books, and I think it ends around the time when his 5th book is about to come out, which is the one that really puts him on the map, wins him, I think, the Nebula Award. But it's about his time mostly centering around 1961 and what life was like in the city in general, what life was particularly like in the East Village, and what life was like for him as a young gay black man. And all of those things interplay here in his memoir. And what life was like in an open marriage as well. Marilyn Hacker, I believe, is who he was married to at the time. And she was a poet. And one of my favorite things in the memoir is, as he's recounting in these vignettes throughout the book, all these particular memorable events of this particular time in his life, Marilyn was writing poetry about them as well. And he takes some of her poetry that she wrote about the same incidents he goes into detail and tells you about, and then reprints her poem. So to be able to read her poetic telling of the same event he just spent 20 pages going in depth about, and how she takes all of that and through poetry just like shears it right down to these like just intense moments. Really fascinating kind of juxtaposition of each other. And I thought it was a brilliant move on his part. And I assume her part in agreeing to it to have them included in this memoir. Now, one of the most interesting things about this is how the book begins. And he starts off telling you about his father's death. Now, his memory remembers, my father died in 1958 when I was 17. This is how his brain remembers it. And this is what he remembers happening at the time of his father's death, the funeral, music, books, other things that were all happening in society at the time. And then someone pointed out to him, you weren't 17 years old in 1958. You were 16. And your dad died in 1960 when you were 18. And him going back and finding that was actually correct and his memory of it was wrong kind of seems to be part of what prompted him to want to write this memoir in the first place. And how does the human brain take such a galvanizing moment in your life that you have vividly remember pieces of, and then just picks it up and lifts it and drops it somewhere else in the wrong time? And even you make your own age is wrong. So the year is wrong, how old you are is wrong. Things that were happening around you had nothing to do with his death, but your brain takes these separate events and melds them into this picture. And your brain is convinced that that's what happened. And I like the fact that he tells us how his brain remembers it, and then tells us of him discovering that's wrong. Those dates are wrong. Your age was wrong. The year was wrong. And then him giving us the factual things he's discovered and looking back at it. And then talking about the differences between the two and how important it was to him to include both versions. Because if he only told the version his brain remembers, it wouldn't be true. It wouldn't be factual. And not a great way to start a memoir out, by even if inadvertently lying. And then if he only told the factual version, it wouldn't be true to him and who he is as a person and how his own memory works and his brain works. So the fact that he takes the time to tell us how he remembers it, factually how it is, and then talks about what that might mean and how the brain works. Really, really just a brilliant way to open the memoir up. And then the memoir itself then works through his time in this new marriage, their personal struggles, their struggles with each other, the challenges in society itself, what New York City was like at that time of the early 60s, which was still pretty much the 50s. The just revolutionary part of the 60s would come a few years later, and this hadn't really happened at this point yet. And his world in the East Village is a literary world. It's filled with writers and poets and artists and like postmodernist artists, like just experimenting and pushing the boundaries and just coming up with crazy stuff. And it details what his personal life was like, what the marriage life, an open marriage is like, how they had interplay and with friends and just weird random people who come in and out of their lives. And the struggle of just finding enough work to be able to pay the bills, to have a place to live at all. And it's a really great snapshot of New York City, but in particular the Lower East Village. Now, as a New Yorker, I'm born in New York City. That'll always be my home. So I know a lot of the places he talks about. Some of the specific stores and coffee shops and things are gone now. But the neighborhoods, those streets, are streets that I walked 20 years later. Streets that at that time in 61, some of my uncles and my father were walking. They were in these same areas a lot at the same time. So it's nice to be able to go back and look at a neighborhood that I hung out in the 80s and in the 90s, of what that neighborhood was like in the 60s, particularly the early 60s. So for me, it adds a personal enjoyment because of my personal connection to New York City. And one thing to understand about this memoir is, because it's a series of vignettes, he doesn't write in a linear fashion either. He goes through a series of things that happen, kind of talks about them, talks about the people, how his mind starts developing story, how his mind works he spends like a whole long chapter where he and Marilyn are just taking a walk across, I think, the Brooklyn Bridge, over into Brooklyn, and then back. And the process his mind goes through in that walk, which is, and as a New Yorker, going on those long walks, particularly at night, was kind of a thing that a lot of New Yorkers do, particularly thinkers. We go out and we wander and we walk around, and our mind kind of works through issues, or as a writer or reader, you work through stuff, you let it percolate and kind of form on its own while you're wandering around. And I like that he covers that aspect of it, that's part of how he functions as well. And but really, really interesting. And what the literary world was like then, it's so completely different today. I mean, you can't, in there they were just meeting like writers and poets and famous authors, and just they knew people and showed them the draft, and they said, okay, we'll print that, because they were looking for stuff to print at the time. And it's a totally different world today, the literary game and the publishing game. So there's so many different things that are really interesting to look at in here. And another favorite thing of mine about how he tells this time of his life is he'll work through his, like, the main storyline of his events. And then in a later chapter, he'll go, remember that event I told you about earlier in the book, this thing here. And he goes, well, now let me tell you about what was happening. And I don't know if he uses the phrase, or I know I used it in my review on Goodreads, about what's happening in the margins. And he'll then start telling you about other things that were going on in his life that weren't part of his main circle. And he goes into other people he met and had sexual relationships with or intellectual relationships with, and just other things he was doing that weren't part of the main story and didn't need to be told in the main story. Because that's part of how he works through his life here at this particular time, is he'll run through this event and the people involved. And then he'll come back and he'll run through a side event that was happening, interplay at the same time, but that would get muddy down the main action in his life. So he leaves it out and then comes back to it and tells it separate. And again, really interesting way to just kind of layer in and layer in and layer in the story of your own life. It's certainly not boring at all. And if you want an insight into particularly what the, I guess, gay community was like down in the village at that time, you'll get a lot of that in here. He goes into detail about what life was like, particularly on a social level, because homosexuality at the time was still, this was pre-Stonewall and pre-all that sort of beginning of the gay sort of civil rights movement, years before that. So it was looked at from society as like, there's something wrong with you. So their entire kind of social interaction of being gay in the community, it was kind of underground. And it had this interesting sort of side effect in that because it was all just kind of done under the surface, it was anything goes. And that actually stays true in the gay community throughout most of New York City. My older brother's gay. I'm not, but I know that community very, very well, particularly from back in the 90s. I've run in some of those circles, even though it's not my lifestyle or at all. Not that it's any big deal, but so I'm familiar with how things impacted that sort of subculture in the city in the 90s. So it's interesting to see it here in the 60s. And if you want an insight into how AIDS spread like wildfire when it hit the gay community and how it hit it so hard and fast, even though this book doesn't really touch on AIDS because it's 20 years before that happened, he mentions it towards the tail end. But this is mostly about 1961-ish, 62. But you can see why it just ran like wildfire through their community when it finally did hit years later, because of just what the lifestyle was like. And he's not judgmental in society, like oppressing anything, and he's not blaming anybody. He's just society's ebb and flow, cultural's ebb and flow within them. Societal norms and abnorms change, and they go in cycles throughout the decades. And this is telling of this particular time when this is how the societal structure was, and the general impacts it has because of the way things are structured. And it's just a really, really interesting insight and really interesting look. And there's a whole, like the tail end of the book details him and a friend of his and his wife's who was basically a third partner in their relationship as a married couple for quite a long time. He was originally from the South, and Samuel R. Delany, whose nickname is Chip, how Chip and Bob decide we're just going to hitchhike down to the Gulf in Texas from New York City. And he goes into explicit detail about his entire hitchhiking journey, everything he can possibly remember about it, and then making his way down there and spending a few weeks working the shrimp boats in the Gulf Coast, with Bob on a different boat and him on this boat, and just his sort of experiencing Texas in 1961. And he's extremely light-skinned, so most of the people down there I don't think understood or even noticed he was black. But that was the first time that he really saw the segregated America. Because even though you didn't have civil rights really in New York City yet, it wasn't a vastly segregated society the way the South was. There's obviously segregation, back then with separate bathrooms, separate restaurants, and separate things, but the city itself, New York City, wasn't like that in a lot of places. But the South was very, very divided among those lines. So it was a very eye-opening experience for him to really experience that firsthand. And again, just a wonderful, wonderful book. And I'm really glad. I've been wanting to read this for a long, long time. And again, just as a writer, and his command of language is just, it's one of my favorite things about him, of how well he understands the English language and the depth to which he knows it. If you want a writer who you're going to need to have a pen and a pad and write down words to try to go and learn them and study them, and where do they come from and how are they used and how does he use them, he's one of those authors that your understanding and depth and breadth of the English language will grow as you read his writings. And just to close this out, I'm going to read what the tail end of my Goodreads review was about this book, like my little summary of it. And he goes, this makes for a fascinating, non-linear, richly layered peek back into Samuel R. Delany's life and how memory and the writing of memory interact, clash, and coalesce. And absolutely 5 stars out of 5. Highly, highly recommended if you're into memoirs at all, if you're into what literature, writing, like becoming a writer in the 60s was like, if you're interested in just that social structure of New York City and what life for a young black gay man was like. Highly recommend it. And just the poems alone from Marilyn are just the icing on the cake in this book to me. So glad he put those in there. And I guess that's all I have to say about this. So that's my book review. I highly recommend it. Again, Delany's a brilliant author if you like science fiction or fantasy. He calls himself, I think, a science fantasy author, which I think is pretty accurate. Definitely go check him out. And one little side tidbit here, one little last tidbit. The 4 books that he ends up writing and getting published for that this time period covers are the 4 or 5 books of Delany's that I haven't read. I started, I think, at like book 6 in his catalog. So I really do need to have to go back and read the books that I now know his life, what he was going through in life while he was writing. So I do have 3 of them. I just haven't read them yet. And the other 2 I'll have to get around to picking up. But anyway, that's it. Again, a 5 out of 5 star read. This was also a read for Nonfiction November. So I'm really happy that I decided to do this for Nonfiction November. I'm going to have a book review coming right after this of my second Nonfiction November read, which was Bob Dylan's Chronicles Volume 1, which by chance I picked for my Nonfiction November. It also takes place in New York City in 1961, except it's about what life was like in the folk music world in the West Village in 1961. So it ended up being the perfect read to read right after this, because I just spent a few weeks reading about life in the East Village in 1961, and I followed that up with life in the West Village in 1961 in these 2 memoirs. So anyway, I'm going to sign off here. This is Charles of SirBookSage. Happy reading.